I still remember the exact second I misread my own husband. It was 30 seconds after my mother walked into the venue. She was wearing the slate-blue dress she'd bought in March, the one with the pearl buttons, and she looked beautiful, and she had a bruise on the inside of her forearm that she was trying to keep turned toward her body. I saw it immediately. Ryan saw it a moment later when she hugged him, and that was when his face did something. He smiled. Not at her, not at me. He smiled the way a person smiles at something private, a thought, a conclusion, a small piece of information clicking into place. It lasted less than a second, and then it was gone, and he was embracing my mother and telling her she looked beautiful, and everything continued. But I had seen it. My name is Sarah. I was 34 years old, and I had just married a man whose smile at my mother's bruise I could not explain. I told myself I would think about it later. I thought about almost nothing else for the next 4 hours. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Ryan had already done something about it. 6 weeks before. Subscribe if you haven't. A new story every day. I am an occupational therapist. I have been one for 12 years, and in that time, I've developed a way of reading what people's bodies are telling me that operates separately from what I consciously decide to notice. Posture, tension, the way someone enters a room, where a person's shoulders sit when they're talking to a specific person. These things carry information. I was trained to receive it. 3 years ago, a 46-year-old patient came to see me with shoulder pain that wasn't responding to any treatment. It was our second session. Halfway through the assessment, I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't a repetitive stress injury. It was the physical pattern of someone who had spent years contracting their shoulders in anticipation of something that could happen at any moment. Her body had memorized the state of alert. I referred her to the right resources. Months later, she sent me a message of thanks. She had left a situation she'd been trapped in for nearly a decade, 20 minutes with a stranger in a clinic, 2 years beside my own mother, and I didn't see it. That is what intimacy does to attention. It creates zones where you decide not to look, and then you forget that the decision was yours. I want you to understand that before anything else, because it is the center of everything that happened. My mother's name is Helen. She is 62 years old. She spent 30 years as an emergency room nurse, which means she has seen everything a person can see in terms of what human beings can survive and do to each other. And she carried that knowledge with the quiet professionalism that defines her. She raised me and my brother Cal essentially alone after my father left when I was 8 years old. She is the kind of person who fixes things before you realize they were broken. When I was a child, she knew when I was anxious about something at school before I said a word, and she never asked directly. She simply appeared with something small that helped, a different snack, a conversation about something else that always found its way to the real thing. She has that attentiveness to people, to what they need before they ask for it. I inherited a version of it professionally. She has it in the blood. She worked full shifts, packed lunches the night before, showed up to everything there was to show up to, and never once made us feel the weight of what that required. I have often wondered what she gave up to be that person for us. I never asked directly. Maybe I should have. Frank came into our lives when I was 19 and Helen was 47. He was steady, calm, present in a way that felt like something she had earned. He had his own contracting business, had been married before, had adult children who were polite when we met them. He seemed like someone who had figured out how to be a grown man. He was attentive to my mother in small, consistent ways. He remembered things she mentioned, showed up when she needed something handled at the house, made her laugh at dinner. I liked him. Cal liked him. I think we were relieved, the way adult children are relieved when a parent finds someone. We stopped worrying about her being alone. They married 3 years after they met. I was at the wedding, and I remember thinking she looked younger somehow, lighter. I don't know exactly when it changed, because it didn't change all at once. The drinking was always there in the background. Frank drank at family gatherings the way some men drink, reliably a little too much, but in a way that was easy to file under, That's just Frank. A glass of whiskey after dinner that became 2, a beer at lunch that became 3. It moved slowly enough that by the time I was noticing the volume, I had already become accustomed to it. In the beginning, even with the drinking, he was still who he'd been. Funny, present, the kind of person who fills a room. There were family dinners in the first 5 years where Frank drank more than he should and was still the best company at the table. I laughed at his stories. Cal asked about his construction work. Helen sat beside him and seemed at ease. I can't pinpoint exactly when that shifted. It was like the alcohol itself. It arrived in quantities that became normal before I noticed they were too much. The drinking didn't change, but what the drinking did to him kept changing. He became less funny and more resentful. The stories got longer and fuller of grievances. The comments about Helen moved from kind to neutral to something that was neither kind nor neutral. There was a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago that I think about now. Frank was on his 4th drink before the food came out. He made a comment to my mother about something on the table, something minor. And the comment itself wasn't cruel, but the tone underneath it was. The kind of tone that tells someone they've done something wrong without specifying what. Helen set down what she was holding carefully and didn't respond. And the way she set it down, deliberately, without looking at him, told me something. After that, the conversation continued. Cal told a story that made everyone laugh, and the tension dissolved the way tension at that kind of dinner dissolves. Not because it was gone, but because everyone simultaneously decided to act as if it were. I helped clear the table, said goodnight, drove home. I didn't call Helen the next day to ask about it. I told myself it was holiday stress and not my business. It was my business. She is my mother. I knew that, and I chose the comfort of not knowing. Every time I chose not to look, it became a little easier to choose again. That is how it works. You don't decide once to never look. You decide today, and tomorrow, and the month after. And after a while, the not looking is just part of who you are. What I know now is that what the body keeps is different from what the mind decides. That is something I understand professionally. Years later, when I finally knew the full truth, I realized I had been holding tension in my shoulders at every family dinner for at least 3 years. A low-grade vigilance I had normalized as part of being around Frank. My body knew what I had decided not to know. The difference between me and Ryan was that he had let what he knew reach the surface. He had done something with it. I had buried it more firmly each time. Ryan and I met when I was 29. He was 32, a police officer working cases in the domestic violence unit. We met at a work event, a fundraiser for a family shelter that my clinic co-sponsored, and he was easy to talk to in the way that people with difficult jobs are sometimes easy to talk to, because they've stopped performing ease and simply have it. We talked for 2 hours. He asked questions he actually wanted the answers to. I gave him my number. He is methodical and quiet and does not use many words when fewer words will do. He has opinions, but he doesn't announce them. He watches. I noticed this about him early. The way he sat in a room, who he was tracking, what he was taking in. I recognize the professional attention because I have it too, in my own way, and I trusted him almost immediately because of it. There was something specific I learned about Ryan in those first months. He never tried to solve things before understanding them. When I came home from work frustrated about something, he didn't offer solutions. He asked questions. He listened. Only afterward, if I wanted it, we thought through things together. That sounds simple, but it isn't. Most people solve before they've heard you out. Ryan heard you out. Always, even when it must have cost him effort. I thought it was a habit from police work. I understand now it was just who he was. He met Helen and Frank at a dinner early in our relationship. That night, Frank was in a good mood. In the early years, he still had those nights, moments when he was who he'd been when I first knew him. Ryan interacted with him without apparent effort, asked the right questions, laughed at the right times. Anyone else at that table would have said the evening went well. In the car on the way home, Ryan was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Has Frank always been that way with her?" I said, "What way?" He said, "The way she responds to him. She checks his face before she answers any question. Did you notice?" I had noticed. I had filed it away. I said, "He can be a lot, but it's fine." Ryan nodded and didn't say anything else that night, but he asked me about Frank 3 or 4 more times over the years that followed, not intrusively, careful, specific questions that I consistently deflected. "Did your mother seem okay at Christmas? Does she talk to you about how things are at home?" I answered the way I had learned to answer. "She's fine, you know how it is." What I understand now is that Ryan was asking those questions because he already knew at a professional level what he was looking at. The way Frank controlled who spoke at the table, the way Helen positioned herself, always with an exit available, the quality of attention she paid to her husband's moods, too fast, too calibrated to be casual. Ryan had seen those patterns for 12 years. He recognized them in 10 minutes at a family dinner. He simply didn't yet have the proof he needed to do anything about it. 6 weeks before our wedding, Ryan told me he wanted to install a security camera at Helen's house, a small one positioned in the living room. He said it was for when we were away on the honeymoon, so she wouldn't be completely alone, so there would be some way to check in remotely. I thought it was considerate. I thought it was practical. I agreed without asking many questions, which is something I've thought about since. He installed it on a Saturday afternoon while I was at a dress fitting. Helen told me later that she hadn't really understood why he was insisting, but she let him. She trusted him, even then. She said he was quiet and efficient, and when he was done, he showed her the app on her phone and told her she could check the feed whenever she wanted. He didn't tell her he had remote access, too. He came home that evening, and I asked if everything had gone all right, and he said yes, it was fine, and we made dinner and watched something on television and went to sleep. I didn't think about the camera again until the morning after our wedding. The 3 months of wedding planning were intense in the way that wedding planning is always intense. A long list of small decisions that feel enormous and large decisions that feel impossible. And in the middle of all of it, regular life continuing. I was working full-time, Ryan was working full-time, and the weeks went fast. Helen helped where she could. She came to dress fittings, gave her opinion on flowers when I asked, called on the days when I was overwhelmed just to ask how things were going. The calls were short and practical. She was efficient that way. She knew when I needed a solution and when I just needed a voice. But there was something different in that period. I noticed sometimes what she wasn't saying. A pause before she answered when I asked how she was. A way of changing the subject when I mentioned Frank. Once, when we were going over the reception menu on the phone, she went quiet in the middle of a sentence, and when I asked what had happened, she said, "Nothing. Frank just got home." And then the conversation ended shortly after. I filed it away. There was a dinner 2 months before the wedding when Helen came alone. She said Frank had back pain and had preferred to stay home. We sat at the table, just the two of us. The first time in months it had been like that. She was different that night. Lighter, more present, laughing more easily. She asked questions about the wedding that were genuinely curious, not just polite. I told myself it was the absence of daily stress that was doing it. I didn't ask myself what the daily stress was. At the end of the evening at the door, she held me for longer than usual. She said, "You're doing well, Sarah?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, as if she were confirming something for herself. Driving home that night, I thought it had been a good evening. I filed that away, too. My mother arrived at the venue 40 minutes before the ceremony. She was wearing the dress, the slate-blue one with the pearl buttons, and she looked like herself. Composed and warm and carefully put together. She crossed the room and hugged me, and I felt the familiar, particular solidity of her, the way she has always made me feel like things are located. And then I pulled back and saw the forearm. The bruise was on the inside, mid-forearm, the shape and color of something 3 or 4 days old. She'd pulled the sleeve down as far as it would go, but there was a gap when she lifted her arms. I said, "Mom." She said, I bumped into the door frame in the kitchen. You know how dark that corner is in the morning. I know exactly how dark that corner is. I grew up in that house. I am an occupational therapist. I know the difference between a bruise from a door frame and a bruise from someone's grip. I looked at her face. She looked back at mine with an expression I recognized as a request. Please don't. Not today. Please just let this be a good day. I saw that clearly, and I honored it, which is something I have thought about every day since. You look beautiful, I said. She smiled and squeezed my hand. 2 minutes later, Ryan found us. He crossed the room in his suit, and he looked good and calm, and he hugged my mother and kissed her cheek. And when they separated, his eyes went briefly, almost involuntarily, to her forearm, and he smiled. Not at her. Something turned inward. Something private and settled, like a calculation completing. It lasted less than a second. Then he looked at me, and his face was open and present and warm, and he said we should get into position. It was almost time, and I followed him, and I spent the next several hours trying to decide what that smile had meant. The ceremony was 20 minutes long. Ryan held my hands and said his vows looking directly at me, and his voice was steady and unhurried, and he meant what he said. I know that. I knew it then. And I said mine back, and the room was warm with all the people we loved. Somewhere in my peripheral vision, I could see my mother seated in the front row and Frank beside her, a glass of something already in his hand even though it wasn't yet noon. I watched Ryan throughout the ceremony in a way I hadn't expected to watch him on that day, trying to read him, trying to understand what his face had done and what it meant about who he was. He was entirely composed. He didn't fidget or check the time or let his gaze drift. When the officiant asked him to speak, he spoke. When he was asked to listen, he listened. I couldn't find anything in his face that helped me, which was either reassuring or more unsettling, and I didn't know which. I said my vows in a steady voice. I heard his. We signed the paperwork and walked out into the corridor to music I had chosen months earlier for a day I had imagined differently. The reception was in the hall next door, dinner, live music, the string quartet my mother had suggested, and that I was grateful for because she'd been right. Ryan worked the room the way he always does in social situations. Present, economical, genuinely interested in the people he was talking to. He is not the center of the party. He is the person the party is quieter and more comfortable for having there. Frank drank steadily through the cocktail hour. I watched him. Once I started watching, he didn't become loud or unsteady. He became a different kind of still, a controlled stillness that I recognize now as someone monitoring himself. He knew he was in public. He knew there were limits to what he could do, and there was something in that awareness that was worse than if he'd simply been out of control, because it meant the control existed. He chose when to use it. Helen stayed within a few feet of him for most of the evening. She laughed at the right moments and danced one song with Cal, and when the photographer came around, she smiled fully for the camera and then let her face relax when the photographer moved on. She was doing what she had learned to do in public, presenting the version of the marriage that was safe to show. At some point in the evening, Frank and Ryan ended up near the bar together. I was across the room and couldn't hear them. Frank said something, gesturing with his glass. Ryan listened. Then Ryan said something brief, and Frank nodded once and looked away. The exchange lasted maybe 45 seconds. Ryan came back to where I was standing, and I asked what Frank had said, and Ryan said, "Just asking about work," and squeezed my hand. Later, Joanne appeared at my side. She stood for a moment looking at Ryan across the room. Then she said, quietly, "He's been watching Frank all night." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Since we got here, he's been keeping track of where Frank is." I didn't say anything. Joanne left it there. Helen and Frank were among the first to leave. Helen hugged me at the door for longer than the occasion strictly called for, and I held her back. She said quietly into my shoulder, "I'm so proud of you." Then she pulled back, Her face was steady, and she and Frank said their goodbyes and walked out to the parking lot, and I watched them go, and Ryan came and stood beside me. We watched until they were out of sight. Neither of us said anything. Then we went back inside. The next morning, I came downstairs, and Ryan was already at the kitchen table. His laptop was open. He had a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He looked like someone who had been sitting there for a while waiting for something. I said, "You're up early." He said, "Come sit with me." I sat. He said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to let me explain before you react. Can you do that?" I said yes. He turned the laptop toward me. It was the footage from the camera he'd installed at my mother's house. He had remote access through his phone. He had been monitoring it. Not every day, not constantly, but regularly. The way he described it later, he had been waiting to be wrong, hoping to be wrong, checking the feed and finding nothing and hoping that was the answer. 4 nights before our wedding at 11:30 at night, he had checked and found something. He played it for me without narrating. He just let me watch. The camera was positioned in the living room and the image was clear. The lamp on the side table, the couch Helen had reupholstered 2 summers ago, the kitchen doorway in the background. Frank came into frame first. He was unsteady in a way that was different from how he moved at family dinners. His voice when he spoke was slow and deliberate in the way of someone who is drunk and knows it and is working against it. He was saying something about her, the tone I recognized immediately. The same tone from the Thanksgiving dinner, amplified many times over, amplified to the point where there was no longer any way to file it as something else. Helen came into frame from the kitchen. She was in her robe. She kept her voice low and even. She said, "Frank." Just his name. The way you say someone's name when you're trying to reach them from somewhere inside. He turned toward her. What happened next took about 20 seconds. He moved toward her and she stepped back and he got hold of her arm and she said clearly, "That hurts, Frank, let go." And he said something I won't repeat here, and then he let go, and he walked out of the frame. Helen stood in the living room for a moment. She reached up and pressed her hand gently to her forearm, in the same place where I had seen the bruise on the morning of the wedding. Then she went back into the kitchen, and the camera recorded the empty room for a long time. I watched the footage twice. Then I pushed the laptop back toward Ryan and sat with my hands flat on the table. He waited. He has always known how to wait. I said, "How long have you known?" He said, "I've suspected for 2 years. I've had proof for 4 days." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Because you would have called her, and she would have denied it, and Frank would have known someone was watching, and it would have gotten worse before I had anything I could actually use." I sat with that. "And the smile," I said. "Yesterday, when you saw her arm." He said, "I knew what had happened, and I knew I had it on the camera. I knew what I was going to do today." I looked at him for a long time. There's a specific kind of grief that comes from realizing someone protected you from something you should have been strong enough to face yourself. It doesn't cancel the gratitude. It lives right beside it, and you have to make space for both of them at the same time. I held them both that morning without trying to resolve which one was larger. I said, "What do we do now?" He said, "I make a call, and then we go see your mother." We were quiet for a moment. Then I said, "You carried this for 4 days." He said, "Yes." I said, "Through the whole ceremony, through the whole reception?" He said, "Yes." I tried to imagine what that was, carrying the footage, the proof, through the entire day, saying his vows to me knowing, squeezing my hand at the reception knowing, watching Frank drink across the room and keeping his face quiet. I said, "Why didn't you tell me the moment you saw it?" He said, "Because it was the eve of our wedding, and because I didn't know what you'd do with it before I had the right channels activated." He was quiet for a moment. "And because I wanted you to have your day." I said, "Ryan." He said, "I know, but I wanted that for you." I sat with that. There are things you discover about a person that arrive too late to prepare for. You are already inside the thing before you understand the size of it. That was how I felt that morning. Already inside a marriage with a man I had underestimated in ways that would take time to fully inventory. He made the call. I went to get changed. 15 minutes later, we were in the car. Ryan called a former colleague who worked family violence cases. He walked him through what he had, what the footage showed, what the legal options were. He was precise and efficient and entirely without drama. I sat across the table and watched him work and understood for the first time what 12 years of that job actually looks like from the inside. After the call, we drove to my mother's house. She opened the door in her robe, coffee in hand, and looked at the two of us standing on her porch, and her face went very still. Not afraid, still. The way a person goes still when they understand that the thing they've been holding is about to be put down. Ryan said, "Helen, can we come in?" She stepped back and let us in. I said, "Mom, we know." She sat on the couch, the same one I had just watched on a screen, and was quiet for a time. Then she said, "I didn't want to ruin your day." I sat beside her. I said, "How long?" She said, "It got bad about 4 years ago. Before that, it was just difficult." 4 years. I had sat across dinner tables from them for 4 years. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I kept thinking it would get better. Every time it was calm for a few days, I thought that was the start of a better period, and then it would pass." She looked at her hands. After a while, you stopped counting the calm days because you got too afraid of being disappointed again. Ryan sat in the armchair across from us and said very gently what the options were, what the footage would support, what she could do and what he could help with, and what would happen if she decided to move forward. He said it without pressure. He said she didn't have to decide anything today. He said he would be there either way. Helen listened with her hands folded in her lap. She looked at her hands more than at either of us. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Will it work?" He said, "The footage is clear, yes." She was quiet again. Outside, a car went past. The refrigerator hummed. She said, "Okay." 2 words, but I knew them. Those were the 2 words she used when she had made a real decision. Not a provisional one, not one that would be re-examined at 3 a.m. The 2 words she said when she was ready. The process took months. That is the real truth of it. And I want to say it plainly because anyone who has been through something like this deserves to hear it said plainly. It took months. Frank was arrested and then released on bail. There were hearings, a protection order. There were nights when Helen called me sounding lost and frightened, not because she wanted to go back, but because the man she had loved before the alcohol was still somewhere in her memory, and grief doesn't follow a straight line. You can know you made the right decision and still feel the absence of what the thing was before it broke. Both of those things are true at the same time, and no one warns you about that. I didn't always know how to be with her in those moments. Ryan did. He had seen it before, the complicated mourning that follows leaving an abuser. He never told her how to feel. He never said, "You're better off," or "Just be glad you're out." He simply answered the phone and listened, and when she had talked long enough, he asked if she'd eaten, and if she said no, he asked what she wanted him to have delivered. There was a conversation during the process that I keep with me. We were sitting in a waiting room outside a hearing, waiting. Helen had her hands in her lap and her eyes somewhere ahead. After a long silence, she said, "The worst part wasn't the times he got violent. The worst part was the waiting, never knowing which version of him was going to walk through the door." She was quiet for a moment. You start to think the problem is you, that if you were different, he'd be different. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "It wasn't you." She said, I know that now." A pause. It took a while. That has stayed with me. The particular cruelty of an abuse that convinces you it is deserved, not with words, but with the accumulated weight of years of uncertainty, years of calibrating yourself to someone else's mood, Years of believing you have the power to prevent the next time if you just do everything right. The power that seems to be in your hands but never is. Frank eventually accepted a plea to a lesser charge. The footage was part of what made denial impossible. Helen wasn't satisfied with the sentence, but she wasn't surprised either. She said she just wanted it to be over, and when it was over, she didn't talk about it anymore. She took time to leave the house. That also wasn't what I had imagined. I had assumed that once things were resolved legally, she would simply leave. But leaving a house where you have lived for 15 years, even a house that wasn't safe, is not a single motion. It is a series of small, repeated decisions, each one costing something. Ryan helped with the logistics, boxes, transport, what to do with things that belonged to both of them and had no clear owner. He was patient with all of it in the same way he had been patient with everything. No urgency, no pressure, just present for what needed to be done. Helen has her own apartment now. It's on the 3rd floor of a building 10 minutes from my house, with windows that get morning light and a kitchen she arranged exactly the way she wanted it. She bought plants for the windowsill, 4 of them now, a succulent and 2 cacti and something with purple flowers whose name I don't know. She wasn't allowed to have plants because of Frank's allergies for years. She has a camera outside her front door. She installed it herself. She called me afterward to say it was working, and I could hear in her voice that she was proud of it, and I told her I was proud of her, and she said, "Oh, stop," the way she does when she means thank you. Ryan and I have been married for almost a year. That marriage began with something heavy. The footage on the laptop, the call he made, the drive to my mother's house on our first morning. That is not the beginning most people have. But I think it told us something true about each other that might have taken years to learn any other way. He saw what I couldn't see. He acted before I knew to ask him to. He kept it quiet until there was something to show me. That is not a small thing to know about the person you married. I asked him once, much later, about the smile, what he was actually thinking when he saw the bruise and his face did that. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "I was thinking I had it, that it was done, that she was going to be okay." I said, "I thought you were a different kind of person." He said, "I know." We let that sit for a while. Helen and I have a Wednesday habit now. I go to her apartment after work and we have dinner and we talk. The way we talked before I got very good at not looking at things. The conversations are different than they used to be. More direct, less managed. She tells me things now that she kept away from me for years, and I let her tell them, and I try not to let her see me react, because she spent enough years monitoring other people's reactions to know what they cost. Last week, she showed me the plants on the windowsill. The cacti had grown more than she expected. She said, "Apparently, these are very hard to kill." I said, "Good." She put the kettle on. The evening came in through the window. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. We have always known that about each other. I think we understand it a little better now.